Good evening and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Nick Hex and I'm from the University of York, but importantly for this evening, I'm also a Northeasterner. I'll be chairing this event this evening and I'd like to welcome you all here today. Before I introduce you to our speaker, I'd like to just run through a few technical notes just before we get onto the subject matter. So subtitles are available for this event. So to turn these on or off, use the CC Show Captions button, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you're watching the event live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. This is available throughout the event, so questions can be posted at any time, and we'll take those later in the event. And please remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Jake Morris-Campbell. Jake is an award-winning author and poet born in South Shields. His collection of poetry, Corrigenda for a Coast-to-Fine Town, was longlisted for the Ondaatje Prize. And as a BBC New Generation thinker, Jake regularly appears on BBC Radio 3. His recent commissions have included writing for the Lindisfarne Gospels exhibition at the Land Gallery in Newcastle and for the After Dark Festival at the Glasshouse in Gateshead. Jake is co-editor of Maritide, selected poems of William Martin, and he currently works as a teaching fellow in creative writing at Liverpool John Moores University. This evening, Jake is going to take us on a journey into the soul of Northumbria. He's going to read some sections from his book, The Salt and the Ash, and there'll be time for some questions later on. So, Jake, over to you.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for that lovely introduction, Nick, and thanks to the York Festival of Ideas. I'm really grateful to be here. Just to explain, I'm going to launch more or less straight into an abridged reading of the prologue from the book. So you're not going to get all of the prologue, it's a little bit too long, and my voice will definitely break if I read all of it, but I'm going to read kind of 2/3 of it in an abridged format, and that sets the scene, kind of establishes the mood and tone and some of the themes and concepts in the book, and really crucially gets us going on the narrative and introduces everybody to this wonderful miner's lamp, which you can see behind me, also called Nick. So funny little coincidence there. And then Nick Hex and I will kind of pull out some more of the themes and kind of I'll do two very short readings from later on in the narrative as well. So this will take about kind of 11 or 12 minutes. It's just me reading kind of verbatim from the text. So I'm just going to get straight into that. So it's the prologue, first foot. My daughter is snoozing on me. Elmadillis is a few days old. Her feathery breathing matches the rhythm of my chest. Slow fall, slow rise. I trace her crown and fontanelle with a little finger, half asleep myself. It's the tab end of 2021. I've had enough of bad news, so the telly's off. I try to relax into this moment, which I know won't last. Beyond the blinds, the streetlights blink on. Winter is here. My son Griffith is being read to in his bedroom by his man. Suddenly the knocker goes and I can hear my wife, Kate, carrying our eager toddler downstairs. I rise to my feet with Elma asleep over my shoulder, and the four of us meeting in the hall. I open the front door. On the step, huddled in down jackets, are my grandparents. My nana holds forward a bag. Here, this is for you. Inside the little carrier, safely bubble wrapped, is her father's Davy lamp. I want you to add on to it. In the middle of the 20th century, when Nicholas Moore was working for the Heart and Coal Company in a shaft below Bolden, and then later at Westow, where he'd be sent miles beneath the North Sea, this little steel and brass-plated cylinder was his only source of light. As Nick craned his shoulders and neck to chisel fossilized plant matter from the bowels of Britain, its tiny flame would have barely lit his sweaty, smudged brow. I see Nick dreaming of his daughters back home, my Nana Lana still a bairn in arms. I peel away the wrap and hold the lamp up from its scythe-like handle. Time collapses, distance unfurling. With a poof, the wick flares, and in the reflection of the little glass casing, I see Nick's eyes. In the wink of his smile, I turn to see my own children, to whom one day this heirloom will be passed down. My grandparents beam, turning, saying they need to be off. They kiss both of their great-grandkids. They're an absolute joy, Jake, and they're right. I set Nick's black torch down and hold fast to the future. Joyful days are coming. It's 2 minutes to midnight. Now I'm standing outside their front door in Harton, South Shields. It's the late 1990s. An icy wind is rattling up off the Tyne, carrying with it the boom of ships' horns. Fireworks start flying, licorice all sorts in the sky. In my fist, I clasp a triangular hunk of coal. It has been varnished smooth and shiny. Through the door, I can hear screeches of drunken chatter, the bass of the radio, Five, Bewitched, Boyzone and Jamiroquai, then the opening bars of Auld Lang Syne. It's starting. 10, 9, 8. More fireworks, car horns, clouds whose underbellies are lit amber by sodium streetlights' glare. Suburbia pushes the last year out to the blackness of the sea, where the pepper pot lighthouse rings its halo round the town, and the new one comes whooshing in. My granda opens the door. "Happy New Year, son!" He's beaming, red-faced and merry, wishing me many happy returns. I know my job. I step over the threshold, the coal held out like I'm one of the three wise men. Myrrh, frankincense, gold. I present it to my nana, who's puckering up, offering me a bottle of Stella. "Don't tell your mum!" Adults are leaning into each other as felled trees, smooching, sloshing drinks. On the news, Big Ben in the Thames, a huge fireworks display in Sydney, and the Eiffel Tower. Here, the closing notes of Burns' lines ring out as the coal goes back on the mantelpiece, beside a brass ornament of a miner shoveling, his back bent double as he digs a hole he'll never get to the bottom of. The Lindisfarne Gospels book is composed of over 250 leaves of vellum, written in Latin. Made by one man, Bishop Eadfrith, and created as a gift to honour God and his noble follower St. Cuthbert, the Lindisfarne Codex has become the most salient symbol of Northumbria as the Christian crossroads of Europe. Inspired by the Celtic Christianity imported to Holy Island by St. Aidan, himself a missionary from Iona, the Columbine Monastery, an island off the west coast of Scotland, and alluding to a global palette of theological influences, Rome, Greece, Constantinople. The Gospels are a Northumbrian icon par excellence, a bright star burning through the so-called Dark Ages. "Had a way in shite," I hear Nick howling. "What does all of this have to do with a little lamp used by a working class bloke on Tyneside, like?" There was a time, not very long ago, when an item such as this would have been so commonplace as to have not warranted pause or observation of any kind. The very ubiquity of mining and the associated cultures and labour union practices which bloomed around it meant that to someone like Nick, the whole idea of this book would seem daft. But now these items are relics. Occasionally, I'll see them in the background of someone's Zoom screen, polished and gleaming on bookcases, or I'll see them for sale at flea markets, tactile emblems appealing to some Venn diagram, Blitz Spirit Brits and steampunk hipsters. When I was viewing a house for sale recently, a Davy lamp caught my eye, prominently displayed on the hearth. And in a trendy Newcastle bar, I once chatted to a girl in her 20s with a lamp tattooed at her arm. She proudly told me the artist had copied her grandfather's model, and that he had used to work at the seam at Rising Sun, the colliery that inspired Geordie blues rock band, The Animals. Like the miners' lamps, the gospel books have become vestiges, aestheticized, exoticized even, and in many ways coveted, but redundant. Just as those lamps once guided people in subterranean graft, the Gospels once functioned in a similar way, guiding with tunnels of light, a path from drudgery to salvation. In a post-industrial, multi-faith society, what residual stories from these and other items might now tug at the region's compass? The Lindisfarne Gospel spends most of its time covered in styrofoam, sealed in a box and held in darkness in its temperature-controlled archive at the British Library in London. And yet, every 7 years, back to the northeast it shuttles, gan in Yem. For a few months at a time, we are blessed to see them, before once more the lid is closed and they're left to dream of the road. Now that I have this lamp, I want to use it. A relic from the northeast, it seems fitting that it should follow the expedition of the region's most famous relics, a lantern parade illuminating a path from the coast to the cathedral. Starting at Holy Island, where in the 7th century the Lindisfarne Gospels book was created by Adfrith, working by sun and candlelight, I'll carry Nick home. Like me, he's an old County Durham lad, forged in the place where the Gospels once sat on the high altar, even though his place, beneath the bowels of Britain, was literally and figuratively beneath the base of the economic pyramid, which sent coals from Newcastle to the world. In religious, occupational, artistic, and more broadly cultural terms, the crucible of this region can be traced back to the pragmatism of the lamp. A person finding fuel to burn and using it to illuminate a task, be it a monk copying scripture, a miner hewing coal, a submariner scouring oceanic depths, the lighthouse keeper oiling the flame ashore, or a poet crafting verse, all needed beacons. Our first known texts were etched onto cave walls, figures showing human struggle and sacrifice, but also wonder and celebration. In the northeast, wooden tablets found near Vindolanda off Hadrian's Wall show the prosaic writings of everyday people living in garrison settlements during the Roman occupation, the shopping lists they made, notes from the edge of empire, sealed for centuries in the peat below us. When paraffin combusts and the flame ignites, silhouettes grow and dance from their source, casting the long shadows our first footsteps grow from. Here, let me hold up my lamp. Let me tell you a little story.
That's lovely, Jake. That is we got a little bit of applause there from our
Thank you.
that's wonderful. I mean, I've read your book from cover to cover and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think, as I mentioned, I recently went on a trip up to Whitley Bay and went quite a long way along your journey as well. Not with a lamp, of course, in that sense. So, I mean, your introduction there brings out a couple of sort of really key themes, I think, in the book about collective working class pride juxtaposed with religious spirituality. And I think that was probably maybe the first area to sort of just explore a little bit more about what your thoughts are on that. I mean, there's a good example, I think, in the book. One of the chapters talks about Jarrow being a key religious center for Europe in the 7th century because of, mainly because of the Venerable Bede, but also as in the 20th century became the center of working class protest in England. And that juxtaposition of those two things is quite interesting. So, I mean, do you want to just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the book is split in two parts, just to give a little bit of a kind of some architecture to it for those who haven't read it. At the end of part one, I cross over the time, having made my way the opposite way to you, Nick. So I walked sort of north to south, started at Holy Island. So the part one concludes with me on the Shields ferry, basically, and traveling from north to south Shields. So part two, which I named Stringing Beads, as I guess a pun, a play on words, on that idea of kind of bead, B-E-D-E, and then obviously B-E-A-D, and that idea of kind of stringing that kind of history and historical lineage, way back through the centuries, really. And to touch on that idea of kind of the past being this thing that in many ways does kind of live on and have reverberations and kind of makes waves, I guess, to use the festival theme. So yeah, the beginning of part two, at St. Paul's in Jarrow, and for anyone who's familiar with South Tyneside and with the region generally, this part of the route is sort of what I think of as kind of the region in microcosm in many ways. It's sort of the Camino of the Northeast that I kind of came to use as the kind of epithet for this route. It's sort of that in miniature, because you walk from the south shores of the Tyne at St. Paul's, and in kind of 8 miles, maybe 9 miles thereabouts of kind of meandering track, which goes from one very big post-industrial river to another big post-industrial river. You sort of get everything, really, the best of the region, sort of a bit of hill and countryside, urban kind of built up areas, layers and layers of history, and sort of little residues and traces of all sorts of things. So I am biased, of course, because I was sort of walking this bit very much, on home turf through the kind of the heartland of where I grew up in South Tyneside. But it does, I think, encompass that kind of that core spirit, really, and even kind of that idea of the soul of the region, the soul of Northumbria. And yeah, and it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's probably far-fetched to think of the Jarrow March, which originally was I believe called I think it was originally a pilgrimage, or it had a name. It definitely had a different name, and somebody might put that in the comments and correct me at the end. But that idea of kind of processing and kind of walking together, and obviously that was done under Ellen Wilkinson, in the early 20th century to fight for kind of, well, to fight for people's lives, basically, and to put food on the table at a time of great economic hardship. And it, came to symbolize a lot of the problems, didn't it? And with kind of unemployment and stuff. But that idea of it kind of being something that people did together, and that they would walk, and that there would be something really powerful about them doing that in unison. I think it isn't accidental that we have a kind of longer lineage of that in the region, and that obviously that comes out of kind of this idea of religious and kind of devotional pilgrimage. But I think it also taps into, even on a sort of secular level, this idea of kind of strength in numbers, and kind of wanting to do things for the greater good and for a kind of sense of collectivity. So yeah, those sort of resonances were really powerful in that section. And for anyone who hasn't walked that section, or on any of this Camino, if you want to kind of digest, I would recommend doing that short section. You can comfortably do it in a day, and kind of get the best of the region, really. So yeah, that's a good place to start, Nick. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true that I think that collective sort of group coming together is definitely, and obviously, we witness that in our big football clubs as well. Sort of there's this sort of
Yeah.
communal devotion as well. So I mean, I think there's also something in there that, and we've talked about this as well, about remembering what's gone, but
Mm.
using that to interpret future possibilities. And I think that we've discussed this about where the region is now, and what the future possibilities hold. And I mean, I think there's, you talk about Ashington, for example, which is an old well, it's still a village town in North Tyneside, and the depiction of Ashington as unmoored from original purpose, but still somewhere people live, I thought was very powerful. And it's also true for many towns and cities in Yorkshire and Lancashire, for example, which once had lots of textile industries, which have now declined, disappeared. The towns are still there, so there's a sort of very much a sort of a remembrance of what's gone, and what's coming. And you talk about the pitmen painters, the people who used
Mm.
to work in the pits around Ashington, who now capture everyday life through painting rather than just simply a nostalgic view of what went before. So I think there is something in that as well, perhaps.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about Ashington for a second, and then I want to go back to just a very short passage on Bede. But yeah, Ashington, whilst we're on the subject, it sort of, in many ways, yeah, it can be read as a town without purpose. So when I went up there, I was chaperoned around by the artist Narby Price. And Narby is a trustee for the Ashington group, the Pitman Painters, as they're colloquially known. And Narby sort of pointed this out. There's these voids and gaps and absences in Ashington, you know, right up to like the present. So like there'd been this ongoing spat over whether the Northumberland County Council would move their centre of operations to Ashington, and it was all sort of apparently going to happen, and then it didn't. And so there's this sort of like Ashington hole where there's just a wasteland basically in the centre of town. And it's a funny place because there are these voids and gaps, but there's still this incredible pride and feeling of kind of potential. And I think that that's been beginning to be realized, you know, with the reinstatement of the rail line, you know, out of Newcastle into southeast Northumberland. There's a sense of kind of optimism, I think, with some of these kind of infrastructure projects that are beginning to happen. And Narby really pointed me to some of the textures of that, and to kind of get, you know, get beyond the fact that, you know, on one hand it is quite challenged, and it's quite deprived, and you know, it isn't sort of as glitzy as Bamborough or as Sea Houses or Beadnell. It isn't the kind of picturesque Northumberland, you know, that what I like to call sort of Sunday supplement Northumberland. That is not Ashington. But to look at it and view it and judge it on those terms is to sort of miss the point, actually. It really did have its heart ripped out. And those painters, the Pitman painters, captured, I guess, the idiosyncrasy and the beauty on a very kind of quotidian way of just very everyday kind of scenes of football and the chippy and kind of kids playing and stuff like that. And they're beautiful, beautiful images. And they've since, of course, been you know, immortalized on Broadway thanks to Lee Hall's play. So yeah, Ashington's a fascinating place, and I also go to Camas in that chapter as well, out on the coast, and visit an old miners' hall there where artists are doing fascinating things. Playwright Alex Oates and his partner Esther Hoos are doing wonderful work with kind of dance work and choreography and stuff, and really involving the community and kind of getting, you know, giving the community, I guess, that sense of ownership and saying, you can do this, you can be an artist in this community, you know, you can have a different future. So that was really heartening. If it's all right, I'm just going to briefly read that section from
Please do, please do.
it's from the Ash Path chapter 7, and it's just to kind of, I guess, give a little flavor. It's only kind of half a page, to give a sense, I guess, of the scale and the I guess the legacy and the name of Bede and what that means to me. When I tell people about Bede and about this part of the world, about the little churches nestled between two great northern rivers, where works of towering intellect and artistic majesty fermented, and where the disparate strands of what we now understand as the English race began to be woven into a discernible thread, I worry that I'm over-egging it. But walking the short route between the monasteries these past couple of days, reacquainting myself with the craftsmanship and civilization which came from this crucible, I begin to have the opposite feeling. Maybe I've undersold it. For anyone who's come from this place, it should be a great source of pride to understand that this was once a prodigious centre of cultural production. As a writer, knowing that I stem from the same place as people like Biscop, Chelfrith and Bede, that I've trod the same hills, walked the same riverbanks, listened to the chattering of the same birds, I feel enormously humbled. The writer's vocation is often a solitary one. But when I look out over the Tyne or stand by its smaller tributary, the Don, imagining the scribes working by candlelight in drafty monasteries, I can hear the call of kinship at my side. Put these words in a coracle, sail them over the waves. Whatever's on the other side of that great frequency, however far or near these sentences sail, I'll always appreciate the long trail of ink from Bede's quill.
That's that's great, Jake. And I think it sort of sets up the next sort of next question I wanted to really ask you, which is around, because you talk about writers there and
Yeah.
link to Bede. The use of poetry is interesting, and I obviously, you know, your wider collection of work is great, and I love the way you use language in a way that people, it reflects the way normal people talk rather than anything more high blown. And so we talked about the use of poetry being used as a way of remembering the past in a way that's different to conventional history. So obviously, you know, historians, and I think you were at great pains to say a lot of the looking back in your book is not, it's not meant to be conventional history. It's not meant to be a bunch of facts and figures, but it's about how we think about the past and heritage, our heritage, without sentimentality and nostalgia. And I really like the line that you said about what the census data fails to capture, the lyric poem can reclaim. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that sort of that theme, maybe about the way poetry can help us interpret the past?
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah, so I'll read another very short section in a minute to kind of give the scripted answer. But kind of, yeah, just thinking aloud and immediately responding. So I guess in 2016, I was about a year into a PhD, and that was a practice-led PhD and kind of led to the publication of my first collection. But it also involved writing a kind of minority critical thesis. So for anyone who's kind of done a PhD in creative writing or in English literature, you'll kind of have some idea of what I'm talking about. For anybody else, basically what I did was looked at four Northeast poets sort of writing in the post-war period. Some of them big names like Basil Bunting and Anne Stevenson, others sort of less well known. And one of the less well known ones was a guy called William Martin, Bill to his friends and family. And we've just put out this month the selected poems of Bill Martin, and that has been a journey. Well, it has really been a journey, kind of a decade in the making. So Bill died in 2010, and in 2016, I was made aware that there used to be a pilgrimage which Bill and his friends and family would walk every year at Durham Cathedral. And so with Bill's son Graham and other poets in the region, including Peter Armstrong, we kind of rekindled this and decided that a good way to kind of remember Bill's life and his work and his poetry would be to strap the boots on and to walk to Durham and to kind of read his poems back into the landscape. So every summer solstice or thereabouts now, this is what we do. And so in chapter 9 of Between the Salt and the Ash, you've kind of got a part of the pilgrimage which I've already done many times before, and this happens a lot. I think, well, it certainly happens a lot in my book, and I think it happens a lot in travelogues generally, and kind of in other, kind of landscape, new nature writing, where some of the terrain is new and unfamiliar and strange, and some of it is very, very much kind of, stuff that you're already acquainted with. So in this short section from Sunderland to Durham, I'm remembering Bill and kind of thinking about poetry as a way of, yeah, I guess of kind of like navigating those questions, those kind of often thorny questions of kind of national belonging and kind of regional pride and industrial history and heritage and all these big badges. So it became this kind of really interesting thing where I started to think about the idea of a poet's pilgrimage and what that might mean to kind of be honoring people like Bill, but also people like, living poets who I walk with. So in Northumberland in Beadnell, I walk a section of the coast there with Katrina Porteous, and some viewers might be aware of Katrina's work. She's also very, very interested in dialect and has captured the fisher folk dialect of Northumberland. Often does work on the radio. So yeah, this idea of kind of walking together and kind of being together. So I'm just going to read a very short little section and kind of unpack that a little bit. So just to kind of explain, just before this, I've encountered the poet Linda France, and Linda is another poet who had kind of been to this area before me and had written a sequence of poems in I think it was in the late 1990s, kind of responding to the Hetton Lions colliery railway that went through this part of the route. And I think this often happens, doesn't it, that there's always a poet. A poet has always been somewhere else before you. And it's a bit of a cliche, really, but it sort of became very true in this book that there wasn't much of this Camino that hadn't already been explored by poets. What is it that makes the artist, in this case the poet, uniquely placed to validate these pasts? We put trust in them to do justice in ways that I don't think the official record can. when I started doing these Maritide walks in 2016, and then later when I began thinking about the broader geography and cultures they encompassed, as I formulated this Camino through the Northeast, I started thinking in terms of a poet's pilgrimage. Traversing the grounds of these places, it's worth thinking about how they've been overwritten by the elegiac impulse, how a poet's peregrinations might inscribe into these tracks and byways the kinds of folk memory that is first experienced bodily and then transmitted into the spoken and written word. I think back to meeting Katrina Porteous in part one. Her lyrical testimony of the Beadnell fisherfolk is cut from the same cloth. This idea that what the census data fails to capture, the lyric poem can reclaim.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Yeah, that was it. Was that last line I found
Yeah,
very resonant, and it does bring that alive. And I think as you say, it's a sort of it's a way of sort of thinking about the past in a way that is perhaps less sentimental and perhaps you know perhaps the way it gets portrayed in, say, the tabloid press or whatever, in that
mm,
sense. And so I mean, I think that, yeah, there's a number of areas or number of things to think about in all of that. And you talked about regionalism as well, just now as well.
yeah,
So we talked about that earlier, and about, I think there's probably a bit of a sense about how people identify with regions. Obviously, we're talking about the Northeast, but we know people have pride in their other regions as well. And I think there is something to be said for thinking or considering the way in which we identify with our own region and perhaps wider geographic areas. So we talked about, sort of, the Northeast, and then you've got
mm,
England and Britain and Europe. And there's that concept of very modern, well, 21st century concept of nationalism, which causes lots of wars and things like that, versus that perceived view in during the Brexit debate about people who identified with Europe as being citizens of nowhere. So there's a real sort of I think people used to be sort of, I think, fairly assured in where they were from and what they felt about that thing, that sort of place, that sense of place. Do you think that's changed over time, or do you think there is a difference now between the way people think about their regional area and perhaps how that interacts with the rest of their country and the world? Do you think?
yeah. I think it's bound to have changed because of, well, for all sorts of economic forces, political forces, technological developments. The fact that we're doing this online, right, and kind of beaming out to, I guess, potentially globally, right? That itself is quite an interesting idea, and kind of almost kind of flattens or complicates that idea of kind of rootedness and that assuredness that you discussed. Um, I think from the point of view of writing this book, what I realized was that to talk about the Northeast, and I am deliberately putting that in scare quotes, is almost not helpful, because when you're in somewhere like Northumberland, as I've sort of already alluded to, it's such a different place to Southeast Northumberland, which itself is very, very different to, say, Northwest Northumberland, where Kielder, and it's much more kind of wooded and kind of hilly. Interestingly, along this route, when I was walking with Catherine Renton, the painter, we got to Walkwith Castle. And again, for those familiar with the geography, once you've kind of dipped down past the castle and kind of head towards Anvil, which is where Catherine grew up, you sort of pass this almost this imaginary line, but it actually isn't imaginary. And I luckily saw an aerial photograph recently which shows this, because anything kind of north of Warkworth is more hilly and there are more trees, and anything south of it is flatter and there are fewer trees. And the way Catherine described it was there's something more kind of gritty, and it probably is to do with the fact that there was coal shipped out of Warkworth Harbour at Anvil, and it was probably more working class and less kind of agrarian and rural. And that's just within one county of England, right? So when you kind of blow that up and add in all of the counties of England, and then, like you say, Nick, kind of then complicate it even further by talking about Britain and the United Kingdom and Europe and Earth, like it gets to be quite a messy and sort of convoluted process. Um, I was saying to you on email before, starting to read Simone Weil recently, and she talks about how in France there was really this need for French citizens after World War II to kind of regain their sense of the region and the kind of smaller unit beneath France, but also the bigger like paradigm above it, which is Europe. And I find that really heartening actually, because I sort of I came of age kind of in the immediate 2008 crisis into Cameron's austerity and then into Brexit, and it was a tumultuous time, and it's I think scarred the country really in all sorts of terrible ways. And I don't want to get on the political soapbox, but I think we do need to remember that we are, as a region, part of this bigger thing, and we have Scotland up there, the rest of England down there, Ireland over there, and and the rest of the continent. And for me, that isn't just a modern or contemporary issue. It's an issue that goes right back to Bede, because Bede and his entourage of monks and his kind of community of a brethren of scholars were importing these ideas from Gaul, from present day France, and the glass, the people who made the glass, the people who got all the books from Rome, right, and all these kind of artisans and craftspeople, they were coming to the northeast of England from continental Europe, and that was very much the thing that kind of, for me, kind of establishes what John Kinsella calls international regionalism. This idea that we can kind of be rooted and proud of where we're from and still kind of have an affinity to a global identity. It's become complicated for me again recently, because last summer I actually left the Northeast and I now live in the borders, the Welsh Marches, in northwest Shropshire, like literally a mile from the Welsh border. And it's a region that I'm sort of I've known for a long time in many ways, but I'm also kind of getting myself used to and kind of figuring out the landscape and the culture and the way people speak. And yeah, I sort of agree with you. I can't really think of myself as English. I think of myself more as somebody from the Northeast, as a Northumbrian maybe, before I think of myself as England. I'm still going to support England in the football, right? If next World Cup and that sort of thing. But I'm wary of the sort of jingoism that can come with that kind of or which can be kind of corrupted by the far right and made problematic in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, I think there was always that age-old thing of Andy Murray being Scottish when he lost and being British when he won.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
there is that sort of just daftness really as well. I mean, I think more on a more sort of optimistic note. I mean, we've talked about you've talked about sort of the region in that sense, and I mean, I think you talk in the book a little, not so much about this, but about the way obviously King Oswald united or created Northumbria through the unification of the kingdoms of Dira and Bernicia.
Yeah.
What do you sort of see as the sort of modern uniting mechanism for that sort of our region? I mean, I think Northumbria obviously takes in bits of Yorkshire and things, and I'm not sure Yorkshire would ever really consider themselves as part of the same region in that sense. But like the wider region, I think still, I mean, you talk a lot about the pride, not just the working class pride or the religious pride, but the just the general pride of being from the Northeast. Do you feel there's anything that sort of really unites people, or where do you think things are going in the future for sort of the Northeast? You've got any sense of that?
Yeah. I you know I mean, I think the obvious ones are the football, and unfortunately I think that we span that great red and white and black and white divide, don't we, Nick? And
Absolutely.
it's incredibly partisan, and you're never going to get everybody certainly in Tyne and Wear to unite behind one football club. You can't even get everybody in Tyne and Wear to sing the Sam Fender songs. And we were talking about how someone like Sam Fender is a kind of almost a kind of Bruce Springsteen for the region, sort of young lad, kind of really waving the flag for these sort of stories of hardship that you sort of turn these anthemic kind of uproarious kind of moments of celebration. I think if the Northeast can get over that kind of tribalism at the level of stupid football fights and all that, then and see beyond that and kind of treat it for what it is, which is ultimately kind of men kicking a ball about. I think there is a bigger possibility behind that. I know that the historian Dan Jackson deliberately used Northumbrian when he was approaching his history, his new history of the Northeast, because Geordie or Mackem or Smoggy or whatever, it just risks bogging people down into their town or their kind of their river. And so yeah, probably getting past that I think would be helpful. The cultural thing I think is really important and interesting, and I'm aware that we're going to bring people in for questions in a minute, but I think I'll probably just end on this point with culture. Um, you know, well, it was Raymond Williams, wasn't it, who said that culture is ordinary, and I think that growing up as a writer, or wanting to be a writer anyway, from kind of late teens, um, that was supported at that point, but nowhere near to the degree that it now is. New Writing North, wonderful organisation, serving the entire of our region, including York, of course, now are setting up a centre for writing in Newcastle, and this will be, supported by DCMS. Lisa Nandy is right behind it. This should be a real flag in the sand moment where everybody who is involved in the arts and culture and generally kind of passionate about the region should be supporting this, because it means, or it should mean, hopefully, that aspiring novelists and poets and dramatists who want to do that kind of now and onward are given the support. And a similar thing is happening in the TV and film industry, for example, with the development of the Crownworks studios in Sunderland. So I think it's really interesting that you've got this hotbed of kind of religious ideas, this 18th, 19th, 20th century working class pride where we built things and we were known for making ships or digging coal out of the ground. And now, again, it is far-fetched to say that that's going to be on the same scale as that. But, we are at the beginning of what could be a very, very exciting journey if the government do the right thing and protect copyright, because that is a big worry. And Keir Starmer, without getting on the soapbox, really needs to realise the damage that can potentially be done by giving all of these big tech companies people's copyrighted work. But anyway, yeah, I think there's an incredibly exciting moment, and I think that what I would like to say is that culture is ordinary, as Raymond Williams said, and there's a vast amount of it in the Northeast, and the fact that it's being supported and people are able to kind of do their thing in this region and not have to go to London or to Manchester or anywhere else, is a really good thing. And maybe that could be the thing that we sit down in another 10 or 20 years' time, and that's it. People are proud of the stories they tell and the art forms that they create in this region. And if that does happen, then I'm happy.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in that. I think as we, I think both of us, I mean, as you say, you've now recently moved away from the Northeast. I've been living away for quite a long time. And I think you observe the changes more when you're not
Yeah,
living there. And I think coming back, like I said, I was up there recently, and you just see the way places like Tynemouth and Whitby Bay are just very different to how they were when I grew up near there. To the extent like, the Spanish City used to be a very, rubbish little amusement arcade kind of thing, and it's now sort
yeah,
of something a bit more smart. There's lots of rewilding going on in some of the pit areas or former pit areas in Northumberland.
yeah,
And Northumberland Wildlife Trust, as is the Durham Wildlife Trust, are all getting involved in all of that. So there are these changes. There's a couple of questions appeared now in the Q&A. So someone called Etta said, "Thank you for revealing so many interesting layers of Northeast history. I'd like to ask do you think the region can go forward in the future?" I suppose you've addressed a little bit of that.
mm.
I suppose where do you see? I mean, you've talked a little bit about how things have changed. What's your ambitious hope for the future? Where do you think optimistically we can get to?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, and thanks for listening. So funnily enough, I'm going to give an example that we couldn't really get into the book because it isn't actually open yet, but it will be very soon. So the Durham Miners Association are imminently going to reopen Red Hills, which is colloquially known as the Pitmen's Parliament. And you might kind of wonder, well, why spend all the money on something that we now know has done great damage to the environment? But actually, what the guys there are trying to do, and I think are going to do very well, is to use the forum of the Pitmen's Parliament to engage the residents of County Durham and the Northeast, and indeed the rest of the nation and the world, in the kind of pressing matters of the day, right? So 100 years ago, that forum was used to debate how to kind of get safe working conditions in a pit in County Durham, or how to raise funds to set up a aged miners home. And that's all brilliant and laudable, but it is in the past. And today, what a forum like that needs to do, almost like those sort of citizens' assemblies that we've seen working really well in places like Spain, I think if an organization like that can kind of galvanize that sense of community spirit, and I think crucially kind of involve people of all ages, right from the young, the young to the old, to kind of come together and be given a voice, really, I guess, because I think that what we have seen in the Northeast is a level of disenfranchisement, and people kind of feeling that they haven't been heard for many generations, and that they're kind of belittled or they're neglected. And actually, when in my experience, when you talk to people, and I encountered a lot of people just sort of serendipitously walking part of this route, people, they do want to tell you about their patch and about what their life is like, and their hopes and their dreams and their ambitions. And I know this all sounds a bit woolly and kind of vague, but I think if forums like that can really actually use kind of community solidarity in a way that we see kind of harken back to, kind of primitive Methodism, really, then that would be a really interesting thing to do. I think the Northeast, I like allied to that, I think needs to probably have a sense of confidence in it, and a sense of kind of legitimacy. And I think people like Kim McGuinness, the newishly appointed mayor, I think Kim's office is doing really interesting things. And whatever your views on Kim's politics, I think having an elected representative who can kind of stand up and say, here we are, and this is what we need, and this is what we want, and this is what we're capable of, I think can only be a good thing. And I think that it's probably about using that soft power, and that kind of cultural conversation through organizations like Red Hills and New Writing North to really tell new stories out of the Northeast, and to give everybody a voice, particularly young people, and perhaps people who are isolated or elderly or vulnerable. So yeah, sorry, I've rabbited on a little bit there, but hope you kind of get the gist of what I potentially see as something practical that might come about.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, Jake. I think the yeah, it is interesting, the new the new mayoral responsibility. We've just got a new one
Mm,
in well, from last year in North Yorkshire and York. So I think most of the country now has these new mayors, and I think, as you said, there's not a lot of funding attached to them, but I think it is just that it's that unifying. But localism as well, regionalism, I think, in that sense. And I think one of the, we were talking before about there's been various things like leveling up and the big
mm,
society and things over the last sort of 10, 15 years. And very much a sort of, I mean, I certainly get the feeling of, if you don't like your national politics, that's not the end of it. You can actually, people were, very down on austerity, thinking, well, there's no money. Well, okay, there are things you can do at a local level, and you can, as you say, you can do, you can begin to start sort of, doing things for the good of the local area without necessarily having to be led into it by politicians or by, regional or national bodies in that sense. So yeah, that's really
yeah,
interesting. So
yeah.
a couple of other questions popped in. So someone says you've sort of addressed this, but how important is a sense of identity to people in the Northeast, and what their heritage lends to that? So I mean, obviously we have a big
Yeah.
we ourselves have a view on our regional identity, but how important do you think that is for people from the Northeast?
Yeah, I think it's massive, isn't it? I mean, to the point of stereotype and cliche, isn't it? We've sort of seen some of the worst excesses of that, I guess, in programs like Geordie Shore, but there's a sort of a reason, isn't there? There is a reason for that, and I guess again that kind of hard drinking culture that kind of came out of hard work and hard graft. Yeah, I think it's. I talk about this in the book in the penultimate chapter about do you remember the passionate people, passionate places logo that One Northeast came up with kind of probably about
Yeah.
20, 25 years ago? So you used to land at Newcastle Airport and you'd be met with like pictures of Penshire Monument or Bamburgh Castle or whatever, and it'd be like passionate people, passionate places. And it got briefly reprised, I think, during the COVID, during 2021, I think, as a sort of way of kind of trying to boost tourism during that time. And say what you like about the campaign. I think the slogan was bang on, and it was very pithy because people here are incredibly passionate, and that history comes through in spades, and people really, I think, feel connected to and take great pride and ownership in their patch, and they want to show it off, and they want to kind of tell other people about it. I mean, for those of us who have left the region, if you ever hear people talking about Vera, or you hear people talking about Sam Fender again, there's these sort of cultural figures and cultural products, I guess, that have kind of entered the wider consciousness, and I think they cut through because people see it as kind of as a way of connecting to a region through the key asset, which, at risk of sounding like a kind of budget like David Miliband here, like the key asset to a region is its people, and we are a passionate and kind of loyal populace, and I think that is ultimately a thing to be celebrated. What I would also say though is that I want people to realize that people who've come into the region have massively benefited it as well. We are a mongrel identity, especially in big river cities like on the Tyne. My family, like so many others, you only have to go back a couple of generations to get the Irish influence. In South Shields, the huge influx of Yemeni seamen. One of them worked with me great grandfather on my dad's side, and I mentioned that in the book. So, we've always been this kind of looking out to sea with rivers, and we've always had trade and commerce with other parts of the country and the world, and that's, I think, enriched and added to that sense of pride. So yeah, let's keep it outward looking rather than kind of inward looking.
Yeah, you've reminded me of a section in the book where you talk about the when the Romans arrived, and there was a local god whose name I can't remember, and I certainly couldn't pronounce, but that was worshipped by the local people, and the Romans, rather than I mean, this is probably how to do, I suppose, colonization well, isn't it? Rather than just coming in and saying, right, you're not going to worship that, you'll worship our gods, and smashing up the deity. They just said, yeah, all right, we'll have him as well. That was it. And
Yeah.
they took that on board, and that I found that really interesting, how the Romans sort of obviously helped to assimilate themselves into the area, kind of thing. You might be able to pronounce the name, I suppose.
Yeah, it was Antennaciticus. So I'll just read the quick passage. This is in
Yeah.
me Turfer section. Amid a housing estate in Benwell in the west end of Newcastle, the remains of a temple to Antennaciticus can be found. Antennaciticus was a local deity, later subsumed into the Romans' pantheon as they conscripted my Geordie forebears into their frontier cavalry, stationing them along Hadrian's Wall. This syncretic approach to belief, a sort of melding of official and folk deities, seems to me fitting for Tyneside's mongrel identity, where converging patterns of migration and commercial influence are a hallmark of the area's marine geography and religious and military passageways and watercourses. I think that's exactly it. Like, you're going back thousands of years of blending and mixing, and people, we're not static, and we never have been. And that's to the great credit and benefit of the region, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point. Um, just one final question then, Jake, that's come through, and I
Yeah.
think it's quite an interesting one, and it's probably more of a personal reflection, I think, for you. I think so. Someone said you showed us your Davy lamp, and
Yes.
the resonance that you've got. Yeah, that's it. Let's have a close up. Let's have a look.
Yeah.
Nick. So someone's asked what resonance this has for you, and how, probably more interestingly, how you might hope to pass on your heritage to your children, particularly as you said you now don't live in the northeast anymore. So do you think that's important to you to be able to pass on that? Because obviously you said right at the start that you were given this on New Year's Eve by your gran,
Mm.
and do you feel that you'll be able to do that with your children and then future generations after that?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I guess there's a few things to say. One of which is that we are often still back in the northeast. So my mum and dad and the rest of me family are all still in Tyne and Weir. So we're sort of back regularly, and it's not like it's not like we've gone to New Zealand or anything. Um, you know, it's a hard one though, isn't it? Because um, I've got a 6-year-old son who's 6 tomorrow, bless him, and we've lived here now. What is it? 11 months, 10 months, something like that. And already I can tell that his accent is changing, and kind of, he's gonna grow up with the vernacular, with the kind of with a different voice and a different accent. But I think because I'm a kind of a bit of a stickler for this, and I'm kind of always talking about things like this miner's lamp and talking about Bede and kind of all these big figures from history. I'd like to think that he and my younger daughter will both kind of remain interested in that, and will, as they get older, kind of have a curiosity to perhaps find out more, and to kind of understand, I guess, that they come from, kind of, I guess, dual heritage, sort of English and Welsh, Northumbrian Welsh, what, however you want to put it, a kind of that, again, that blended thing. And yeah, I'm really interested in it. It's I think kind of leaving somewhere like South Shields, which is still so very much kind of a big village, basically, where everybody knows each other, and moving to the countryside into a much more rural area is been an adjustment for me, and probably more of an adjustment for me than for the children. Um, but I'm always playing them kind of when I'm, I've had a beer or two. It'll be the old kind of Tyneside folk songs, Keep Your Feet Still, Geordie Hinny, and all these sort of when the boat comes in, we'll stick that on Spotify in the car and do the full rendition of all the fishes. So things like that. I think the way that culture kind of permeates and kind of is kept alive in song and in poetry, and that doesn't have to be at a grand event like a gig at the Glass House or anything, or even in a folk club. It can just be a father and children singing in the car, and that probably will be more of how it will be kept alive. And I think that I'm not alone in that. So but yeah, great question, and one that I definitely need to kind of think a bit more on, really. Thank
Yeah,
you.
well, I mean, if it makes you if it gives you hope for the future, Jake, my daughter ended up she's 20 now, and she's ended up at Newcastle University. She's studying English, Lang and
Oh,
Lit.
brilliant. Yeah.
She's living the dream up in Jesmond, and unfortunately, from your perspective, she's also a Newcastle fan as well. So so
Well,
despite
we've all
being
got a cross to bear.
well, I was going to say, but despite being born in Dundee, in fact, and then we moved her
Yeah.
down to York. She's now we're probably up in Newcastle more often than I ever have been for the last 20 years, because she's back there, and and loves the whole region, and we'll see what happens and what comes out of that. But yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's been absolutely fantastic, Jake, and it's been great talking to you. As we said previously, we could probably talk for hours on all this, and be
Yeah.
great to meet up for a beer at some point. So thank you for taking us through that journey through the Northeast, and a place that means a lot to you and to me, obviously, and I'm sure, obviously, to many of our audience members who are giving you a virtual round of applause there. It was a fascinating talk, and thanks for answering so many great questions as well.